Section 1 of Horror Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. A Story Told in a Church, Part A. Published in Belgravia in 1867. What shall we do? We are absolutely locked in. Every door is firmly closed, and I believe it is the doing of those dreadful boys who have been trying to frighten us out of our wits all the afternoon with their ghost stories. And Katie Bernard came laughing back to the spot where we were all standing and saying farewell words, after going through the pleasant labour of decking our little church with holly wreaths and shining laurel. Katie was blessed with excellent nerves, and a constitution that defied winter snows and summer heats, and I verily believe that she could have curled herself up in one of the great pews, and slept the long night away, as soundly as in her own white bed in the parsonage. But there were others amongst us, and I confess I was one of them, who already longed for the warmth of a fire, and who moreover began to find the glimmering of the white monuments and strange sculptured faces round about weird and a little ghostly. "The dusk is falling. This is certainly most annoying," exclaimed Miss Montam, Ella Willis's governess, under whose charge we all were. She turned a little pale as she spoke, a rare thing for her, for a more self-possessed person than that handsome Miss Montam I never saw. "What? Are you too afraid of ghosts, Miss Montam?" laughed Katie. "Those boys will be delighted then at the success of their trick." The governess turned almost scornfully. "I do not understand how one can fear that in which one does not believe," she said, "but I confess I have a particular dislike to remain in a church after dusk. It recalls to my mind the most painful story I ever heard." And then turning hastily away, Miss Montam herself went and examined every door, even tried the vestry window. Those dreadful boys, however, had taken infinite care to bar every mode of exit, and even Dora Montam was obliged to admit that nothing could be done, but patiently to submit to imprisonment until our absence should cause anxiety at our various homes, and someone should be sent after us. Meanwhile the twilight was momentarily deepening, and to my mind, at least, those half-wreathed pillars, those white faces peeping out from between the dark laurel, those stone figures on the two ancient tombs of Sir Guy and Sir Geoffrey Willis, lying with their legs crossed, began to look very eerie indeed. We grouped ourselves about the seats in the chancel, and for a time talked and even laughed, but somehow, first one voice grew silent, and then another, and at last those grim knights lying beside us were not more silent than we. "Well, I must say, this is a dismal way of spending Christmas Eve," at length sighed Kate Bernard. "We ought to be round the fire now, roasting chestnuts and telling stories." "Telling stories! Ah, what a good idea! Why not amuse ourselves by that now?" exclaimed another voice. "Come, Ella, you have travelled, tell us some of your adventures." "I? I never told a story in my life. No, ask Miss Montam, she has a gift for it." The governess had been sitting a little apart from us, closer to the tombs than we cared to go, but as Ella spoke she raised her face, which she had been leaning on her hands, and even in the fading light I saw that she was deadly pale. "I could not tell a story here," she murmured, "unless— would you like to hear the one of which I just now spoke? It is a terribly painful one, an awful one, but—" There was a universal interruption of, "Never mind! Yes, yes! Tell us that, Miss Montam." We all knew the strange power the usually silent governess possessed for storytelling. It was the only time indeed she unbent or seemed like other human beings, but when she did condescend to indulge us, she possessed a fascination which none of us could resist, and we all knew that while listening to her we should care very little for the cold or darkness. This was the story she told us. 10 years ago I was 17, and serving my first year as governess pupil at Mrs. Morris's school near Chichester. No, Ella, you need not look pityingly at me, for I was very happy. Mrs. Morris treated me kindly and fairly, and amongst the girls I had friends whom I loved dearly. Besides, Mount Silver, as the place was called, was conducted on the home principle, and there was not one of us who regarded our existence whilst there but as intensely satisfactory and enjoyable. You may imagine that Mrs. Morris could not have been a very rigid schoolmistress, when I tell you that we even received the news that we should be obliged to spend Christmas Day under her roof, with no greater regret than one naturally feels when one finds the pleasure of seeing dear friends suddenly deferred. The Christmas of 10 years ago was the snowiest I remember. Roads were blocked up, even railways were subject to constant stoppages, and it happened that in our part of the country a small river had been so swelled by the snow as to have laid the surrounding ways under water. So, what with one thing and another, Mount Silver lay separated from Chichester, with almost as many difficulties to be overcome in a distance of 20 miles, as if a hemisphere was between them. Many of us were London girls, and the railway being unreachable, our fate was quickly settled. The only two who remained voluntary prisoners were Millicent Power and her cousin Irena Dupont. Milly Power was the niece of the lady of the manor, Lady Jane Power, who, it was believed, intended to make her heiress, and her home lay but a couple of miles from Mount Silver. But Christmas, or any other Mass, was so dull with Lady Jane, who passed her time nursing her cat, knitting, and physicking her various imaginary ailments, that both Milly and Irena no sooner heard that the rest of us would be forced to spend part of the holiday at school than they begged Mrs. Morris to allow them to do the same. I think we were all glad that they did not desert us, though, perhaps, but I must not anticipate. They were our head girls, our leaders, Milly Power by right of age and rank, Irena Dupont by right of her daring spirit and rich beauty. Ah, heavens, how beautiful that girl was! I see her now before me, with her dark glowing eyes, her oval face, the rich southern blood mantling her cheek with every emotion, so fresh, so eager in her enjoyment of her young life and splendid health. She was cousin to Millicent by the mother's side, but, though daughters of two sisters, there was not a shadow of resemblance, either in character or feature, between them. Millicent was fair, cold, haughty, proud of her ancient family, a little proud, I sometimes thought, of having money always at her command, and being the heiress of her aunt. But I ought not to make any reproach, for she was a kind friend to me, and it was thanks to Milly's purse that my poor wardrobe could boast anything beyond the very humblest attire. How it was that Irena Dupont lived also under the protection of Lady Jane, I never rightly understood. She was not a penniless orphan, I knew, for she often alluded to her father and his vineyards down in the south of France, but yet she appeared to be in a great measure dependent on Lady Jane, and once or twice I noticed that she gave way to Millicent, proudly, but in a manner that betrayed she had a reason for so doing. Were they fond of each other, those two cousins? Ah, that was a question which none of us could satisfactorily answer then, not even I, who was Milly's bosom friend. They sang together sweetly, rode together, but never by any chance were they known to talk together beyond joining in ordinary conversation, and never did I see Irene give Milly one of those gushing kisses which she bestowed so liberally and gracefully on those she loved amongst us. It was not, however, till the Christmas I am speaking of, that I knew the great obstacle between them to be Milly's jealousy of her cousin's beauty. We were sitting in the schoolroom after tea, as merry a party as could be, in spite of our imprisonment, when Mrs. Morris entered rather abruptly, and with not an altogether satisfied expression of countenance. "Millicent, my dear, I want you in the drawing-room," she said, slowly shutting the door. "Your cousin, Arthur Power, has ridden over perfectly desperate at finding the manor house only presided over by Lady Jane, and he declares that the cold is so intense he really can't face it again tonight, and give him shelter I must. Most improper of him to come to a school for young ladies, I am sure." Millicent's fair face flushed, and a peculiar half-vexed smile curved her lips. "Just like Arthur, he is so inconsiderate," she exclaimed, rising with her work in her hand. "He wanted to come down here, but I would not allow that." "Of course not," said Milly, walking rather hastily towards the door. "Ah, Irene, you may as well come too. But Millicent turned almost abruptly, and with a strange forgetfulness of the respect she usually paid Mrs. Morris, she exclaimed, "What for? Arthur is my cousin, not Irene's. She does not know him even." Irene had risen, and was following, but at those words she dropped back into her corner by the fire, and a smile, half angry, half scornful, passed over her beautiful face. "True," she said quietly. Mrs. Morris looked a little puzzled, but even she sometimes gave way to Miss Power, and so, without further remark, she linked her arm in Milly's, and they left the schoolroom. We were not so discreet as our governess, however, and no sooner had the door closed than there was a general exclamation against Millicent, for Irene was the idol of the school, and then the French girl for an instant seemed to forget the restraint she had always imposed on herself, and lifting up her flushed face, with its rich, angry, glowing eyes, she exclaimed, "Nonsense! You forget Millicent is almost engaged to her cousin Arthur. It was natural she should wish to see him alone." "Or natural, you mean, that she should not wish him to see you," exclaimed someone. But if that was Millicent's wish, she was cruelly disappointed. Mrs. Morris, anxious to make up in some measure for our disappointment, had invited the doctors' and lawyers' families, living in the village close by, with the vicar's nieces, to come and celebrate Christmas Eve in the good old-fashioned manner, and no sooner did Arthur hear of the party than he invited himself to remain for it, and not all Mrs. Morris's hints at impropriety and inconvenience could induce the handsome young officer to dislodge himself. To the excellent lady's intense relief, Mr. Power was a fashionably late riser, and she contrived to dispatch us all the next morning to the church, which we were to assist in decorating before he made his appearance, and I firmly believe, as she watched us all pass out of the garden gate, she thought she had manoeuvred skilfully past all danger until at least the evening. Schoolgirls of 17 and 18 are apt to talk a good deal on those subjects which good Mrs. Morris dreaded so, but I don't think my mind was ever much given that way, and Arthur Power certainly never crossed my thoughts when once I found myself in that ancient church with holly and laurel wreaths, waiting to do justice to all the artistic taste we could muster among us. We were soon scattered over the church, which was a singularly beautiful one, though centuries old, it having belonged to a wealthy monastery, and as usual Milly and I worked together. She was not in a talkative humour, and so we spoke little except about the work, and when she suddenly left me, saying she must have a little exercise to warm her, I scarcely missed her. Alas, that she ever took that ramble! She was not gone long, and when she returned she was out of breath, "What do you think, Dora, I have found?" she began, and then suddenly she paused and looked sharply round, for a man's laugh sounded from the chancel. "That's Arthur, let us go and see," she exclaimed. And we did go, and what we saw was beautiful. Irena mounted on a chair, twining a holly wreath round a cherub's head, and there beside her, gazing up and handing sprays of shining green, stood Arthur Power. 2 other girls were near, but it was Irena Dupont on whom those handsome blue eyes were fixed so earnestly that even our approach was unnoticed. "So you have found us out, Arthur, in spite of Mrs. Morris," Milly exclaimed, with a smile on her lips, but oh, such wildly angry eyes! He turned immediately and held out his hand. "Of course, you know I always manage for myself." "So it seems, even your introductions." "As to that, Miss Dupont is a kind of cousin, you know, and therefore an introduction was unnecessary. Besides, I am making myself so decidedly useful that even if I have offended against the Covenant, I ought to be forgiven." "And so you shall be if you will mount and finish this for me," interrupted Irena, and before even he could reply, she had jumped lightly down from the chair and joined another group of workers at the other end of the church. Arthur turned and looked after her rather dolefully, and Milly's eyes flashed. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Story Told in a Church, Part B. Ah, heaven! How well I remember that Christmas Eve! How joyously it began! How gay we were! I know I can say for myself that never since have I laughed with such free-hearted joy as I did that night. There was little ceremony, no elaborate toilettes. We all knew each other, and the female element considerably preponderated. But the dancing was no less delightful, the smiles no less radiant, the enjoyment no less intense. In the early part of the evening, perhaps, there might have been a little jealousy regarding the attentions of Arthur Power, but he soon showed such evident preference for Irena Dupont that the rest retired from the contest. And who could wonder that she should be preferred? Simply dressed in white muslin, with a sash of scarlet silk round her waist, Irena seemed to float amongst us, like some goddess amongst her attendant nymphs. She never seemed to try to be dignified, and yet she always walked like a young queen, always stood amongst us with her tall graceful form, as superior to the rest of us as Diana amongst her nymphs. It was no use Millicent Power looking cold and haughty. Arthur cared not. He saw only those sweet dark eyes of her French cousin, heard only that rich merry laugh, cared only to wind his arm round that pliant waist. Even in the games which relieved the dance, Arthur contrived always to be near Irena, and though now and then he paid attention to his cousin Milly, even she saw that it was because he felt it a duty, rather than because he wished to do so. I thought I knew Millicent Power well. I thought I understood her reserved character, but that night she puzzled me. She was too ladylike to show temper, or even jealousy, at Arthur's sudden desertion. But now and then she glanced at that part of the room where he was with such wild, pained eyes, now passionately angry, now sorrowful, that even I wondered she could so betray herself to him. Still, she did not keep herself away from the rest. She joined in all the dances and games, and talked and laughed as excitedly as any of us, more so almost, and I recollect that it was Millicent's voice which was the first to accept the challenge that led to so much sorrow. Our party was too large to be accommodated, even at the large school table, all at the same time, so we younger ones had taken our supper first, and then returned to the dancing-room, leaving Mrs. Morris to entertain the elders. And it so happened that we had no wise friend near to prevent the commencement of as foolish a freak as ever young wild creatures planned. How it was that the subject of ghosts was started, I know not, but I remember that instead of returning to our games, we stood grouped together, listening to a wild story Arthur Power was telling. And though all laughed and declared their disbelief in it, there were few voices that responded to his challenge at the conclusion. I would wager this, and he held up a small gold locket, that not one person here would venture now to cross the churchyard alone, enter the church, and pass through and bring me a piece of the cypress waving over the broken tomb on the other side. "What, make the tour of the churchyard in this cold? No, thank you," said one sensibly. "Oh, you may put on goloshes and a warm cloak. Besides, it's a splendid night. The snow is hard as iron." "Ha, ha! I see, ladies and gentlemen, it is the white feather, not the cold." "I should not be afraid," exclaimed Millicent. "As you say, it is a splendid night. I will go." "And so will I!" I exclaimed. "And so will I!" exclaimed Irene. No sooner said than done. Upstairs we three adventurous ones crept to don warm cloaks, and then, cautiously opening the front door, for we knew if Mrs. Morris heard aught of such a proceeding, she would quickly stop it, not 5 minutes later, I, with the key of the church in my hand, started at a quick pace over the hard snowy walk. It was agreed that 10 minutes after I had started, Millicent should follow, and at an equal period after Irene was to come, for, argued Arthur, the elders would probably have finished supper soon, and it would not be safe to wait for the return of each before the other started. Ah, how well I remember that mad midnight walk! It was a brilliant night, but the cold was so intense that I had not reached the gate of the churchyard, close as it was, before I repented of my folly. However, I went in. I was not of a timid nature, and that walk across the snowy churchyard was not in the least fearful to me. The silence of the decorated ancient church, about which I had heard legends enough to terrify anyone, affected me more, and I confess, as the door grated slowly on its hinges, I felt sorely tempted to turn and flee. I did walk very quickly along the stone aisle, and it was with a gasp of intense relief that I stepped out into the snow and moonlight again, through the little chancel door, close to which stood the broken tomb and its dark cypress. My hand trembled so that I could scarcely pluck the bough, and then I fairly ran along the side path, which led to the other gate opening into the back garden of Mount Silver. "By St. George, you have only been a quarter of an hour!" exclaimed Arthur Power. "I wonder how fast Milly will run. You look rather white, though, Miss Montam." "The cold is intense," I answered rather crossly, "and it was a foolish thing to do." "Did you meet the ghost of the monk?" "Never mind whom I met, there is the cypress bough." Arthur shrugged his shoulders and turned away, still watch in hand. 20 minutes, no, 25 minutes. Milly must be having quite a gossip with the monk, he said presently, not quite so pleasantly though. 27. Ah, there she is! Yes, there was Milly, ghostly white and shivering. Arthur approached her almost anxiously, and though he made some joking remark about her having met a legion of ghosts, I observed that he took her hand and began rubbing it, and then muttered something in a low tone, which, however, only turned Milly's shivering into a convulsive shudder. "Give her something hot to drink," I exclaimed from my corner, where I was also still shivering. "The cold, no one knows what the cold of that church is." and then Milly lifted up her eyes with a look. Heaven, how that look haunted me afterwards! And she managed to mutter with her sweet lips, "Yes, the awful cold." "I wish to goodness Irena would come now, before Mrs. Morris returns," said someone. "She will be so angry about this." And then Arthur Power looked at his watch again, but this time said nothing. A silence fell upon us all. Not a word was spoken. No one moved even. Everyone listened for that light step which should announce the approach for which somehow we all so longed. The clock struck 1, and again Arthur looked at his watch, and then again that silence continued unbroken, and there, motionless, we all remained waiting for her who was never to come to us. No use our listening, no use watching those slow-moving hands of the great clock. Never, never more were we to hear the fall of those quick light feet. Time might come and time might go, but Irena Dupont would not return with it. Oh, that miserable night! How the memory of it has haunted me! Those sad, horror-stricken faces, which not 2 hours ago had been so happy, the frightened whispering, the coming to and fro of anxious searchers, waving their lurid torchlight over the snow, the sobs, the tears, the wild hopes, and at length the blank despair. How I remember it all, as some dreadful confusion, which, strive as I would, I could not comprehend. A mystery indeed had fallen upon us that Christmas night, a mystery which none could solve. All we knew was that Irena Dupont had gone out, fresh and living, into the snow and darkness, and that she never came back. The path from the house to the church was direct enough, it was perfectly safe, there were no bad characters about. So far as our human ken could reach it, all of us could declare to its perfect safety, and evidence of any struggle or accident there was none. Search was not spared, and for weeks every means of discovering what had become of the lost girl was freely tried. But that solemn Christmas night refused to give up its secret, and the mystery of the beautiful French girl's fate remained still darkly hidden. But, in spite of those great sorrows which come to disturb the current of life, commonplace daily realities must be thought of and faced. I had learnt that lesson in the year of hard struggling I went through on quitting Mrs. Morris's pleasant roof to take the place of junior teacher in a German school. And yet I confess I felt almost horrified at the contents of a letter I received one June morning from my old friend Millicent Power. She was going to be married to Arthur, she wrote, and she hoped I would come and act as bridesmaid. What? Had she forgotten so soon that horrible Christmas story? I thought. With her usual forethought, she had enclosed a banknote for my travelling expenses, and she made her request in terms which a lonely orphan like myself was not likely to resist. Lady Jane was dead, leaving Millicent sole heiress to her property, but Milly told me she could not endure the solitude of Power Place, and still lived with Mrs. Morris, from whose house she was to be married. I was to go to her there, and I should find more than one familiar face to welcome me. It is only those who are homeless who can sympathize with me in the intense affection I bore to that dear old house and all its occupants, and the eagerness with which, in spite of my weariness, I leaned forward in the coach to catch the first glimpse of the tall, ivy-covered chimneys. I knew the horn announcing the entrance of the coach into the village would be heard at Mount Silver, and I quite expected to see Milly's fair face at the garden gate waiting for me. There was one figure standing there between the rose bushes, but it was Mrs. Morris's, not Millicent's. "No, my dear, I would not allow Milly out so late, though the evening is mild," she answered, after the first embraces were over. "Her health is very delicate, and I sent her to bed." Although Mrs. Morris spoke dryly and almost indifferently, I could detect anxiety in her eyes, and I knew that before long I should hear something of the reason, for I was a favourite of hers, and she had always treated me as a friend rather than a pupil. I found that I was to sup in private with my former instructress, and I was scarcely surprised when, as soon as the first hospitable cares were over, she began abruptly, "Do you know, Dora, I am very uneasy about Milly. I am not at all sure that this marriage ought to take place." I started. "I mean, of course, on account of her health. Ever since that night when you remember, Milly has been altering in a manner that perhaps others may not observe, but which I have. There is a family malady hereditary to the Powers, you probably know. Consumption. Ah, I have heard that. I wish it were only that," sternly replied Mrs. Morris, as if forcing herself to utter the words. "It is something more awful. Insanity. Milly's nerves never seem to have recovered the shock of that dreadful night." I was literally too horrified to say a word, and I knew scarcely whether to be glad or not when Mrs. Morris suddenly rose and proposed going to Millicent. I was accustomed to her abrupt ways. Still, when she paused at Milly's door and said in a sharp whisper, "There is a week still to the wedding. We must both watch and do our duty, Dora," I shrank back in alarm. And though that first interview relieved my mind, I had not been 24 hours constantly in Milly's company before I saw that Mrs. Morris's observations were correct. Milly was altered. She would suddenly break off in the middle of a sentence, even about Arthur, and fall into a stony kind of quietude, which was too strange to be the result of mere weakness. Sometimes, too, she was restless, and the anxiety for her wedding day to arrive was incomprehensible and almost painful. She could not endure solitude either, and if by any chance she awoke from one of her frequent dozings, and found herself alone, she would ring her bell with a fury which more than once broke the wire. Still, she never permitted anyone to sleep in her room at night, and I was quite surprised when, the day before the wedding, she asked me if I would mind sleeping on the sofa at the foot of her bed. Ah, that Sunday night was to be another of those which terror scorched into my memory. It was an exceedingly hot night. The room was a large one, on the ground floor, and the open window looked into the garden. I could not sleep. Milly, too, tossed restlessly from side to side, and, though she slept, moaned piteously. Time seemed as if it would never move on, and hours seemed to elapse between the striking of each quarter. I suppose, however, I must have dozed, for suddenly I started up with the impression that someone had passed by me, and hastily looking towards Millicent's bed, I saw that it was empty. Why, instead of rushing to the door, I flung on a cloak, and barefooted as I was, darted through the French window into the garden. I know not. It must have been some fate that guided me, for there, dimly visible passing through the little gate into the churchyard, was a white figure. I flew along, but Millicent went faster than I, and with a strength and steadiness she never displayed in the day. On she went, up the little side paths, never pausing, but going on swiftly, steadily, towards the chancel door. Surely now she must pause, unless by some chance the preparations for the marriage had caused the door to be left unlocked. She passed in. Ah, how I flew then, though why, except fearing some horrible catastrophe, I know not, and at length a second time I stood within that ancient church in the dead of night. Even as I entered, a low, piteous moan directed me to where I should follow my unfortunate friend, and there in one of the grim side aisles, where the stone pavement still bore Latin inscriptions to departed monks, I saw that white figure kneeling and moaning, and bruising her soft fingers against the hard stone. "There, I know it is there," she muttered. "I lifted it then so easily, it must come up again. Don't shriek so, Irena. Oh, oh, don't shriek so." And then, lifting up her white, agonized face, she desisted from her awful scratching at the stone, and put her hands to her ears, as if to shut out some dismal sounds. I stood transfixed with horror, not daring to approach, for I saw that though she had her eyes open, she was asleep. But at that moment the chancel door slammed. With an awful cry the sleeper started up, gazed wildly round, and then I saw her fall prone on the stone floor, the life-blood flowing from her lips. There was no wedding the next day in that ancient church. Millicent Power lay gasping away her life, and murmuring only 2 words, "God forgive! God forgive!" But there was a horrified group standing round that stone, and watching for the return of the explorer of the unknown ancient vault which was found under that cracked pavement. There was no need to make much inquiry as to whose remains those were which then were brought to the light of day. The long dark hair, a small ring, told all that was necessary to be told. Irena Dupont was found again. But beyond those words which in her miserable sleep Millicent Power uttered, no light was shed on the mystery which enveloped her fate. I, who knew all that had passed, and had seen the wild agony of her face as she knelt and tore at the stones, felt that, unless insanity could be alleged in her excuse, Millicent Power's soul was loaded with an awful crime, and as I remembered how she had been walking in that aisle when she left me, and returned uttering that exclamation, which was never finished, I joined fervently in that dying prayer of hers, "God forgive." That stone was broken in such a way that a chance glance would more likely have noticed that it could be raised easily than one accustomed to pass it day by day. Probably she had raised it and discovered the vault, and leaving it open had forgotten it until that mad midnight visit. I had passed through the centre aisle, but Irena might easily have taken the side one, and— but enough of this. It is too dreadful, and— God forgive us all. We were all huddled together as Miss Montam's voice dropped, and if there was a word murmured before we were silenced by the sound of steps without, it was only an echo of the prayer with which Dora Montam closed her story. End of section 2. Section 3 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Summons, first published in Belgravia in 1868. Wanted, sir, a patient. It was in the early days of my professional career, when patients were scarce and fees scarcer, and though I was in the act of sitting down to my chop, and had promised myself a glass of steaming punch afterwards, in honour of the Christmas season, I hurried instantly into my surgery. I entered briskly, but no sooner did I catch sight of the figure standing leaning against the counter, than I started back with a strange feeling of horror, which for the life of me I could not comprehend. Never shall I forget the ghastliness of that face. The white horror stamped upon every feature, the agony which seemed to sink the very eyes beneath the contracted brows. It was awful to me to behold, accustomed as I was to scenes of terror. "You seek advice?" I began, with some hesitation. "No, I am not ill." "You require, then—" "Hush!" he interrupted, approaching more nearly, and dropping his already low murmur to a mere whisper. "I believe you are not rich. Would you be willing to earn £1,000? £1,000? His words seemed to burn my very ears. "I should be thankful, if I could do so honestly," I replied with dignity. "What is the service required of me?" A look of intense horror passed over the white face before me, but the blue-black lips answered firmly, "To attend a deathbed." £1,000 to attend a deathbed? Where am I to go, then? Whose is it? "Mine." The voice in which this was said sounded so hollow and distant that involuntarily I shrank back. "Yours? What nonsense! You are not a dying man. You are pale, but you appear perfectly healthy. You—" "Hush!" he interrupted. "I know all this. You cannot be more convinced of my physical health than I am myself. Yet I know that before the clock tolls the first hour after midnight I shall be a dead man. But—" He shuddered slightly, but stretching out his hand commandingly, motioned me to be silent. "I am but too well informed of what I affirm," he said quietly. "I have received a mysterious summons from the dead. No mortal aid can avail me. I am as doomed as the wretch on whom the judge has passed sentence. I do not come either to seek your advice or to argue the matter with you, but simply to buy your services. I offer you £1,000 to pass the night in my chamber, and witness the scene which takes place. The sum may appear to you extravagant, but I have no further need to count the cost of any gratification, and the spectacle you will have to witness is no common sight of horror." The words, strange as they were spoken calmly enough, but as the last sentence dropped slowly from the livid lips, an expression of such wild horror again passed over the stranger's face, that, in spite of the immense fee, I hesitated to answer. "You fear to trust to the promise of a dead man? See here, and be convinced," he exclaimed eagerly, and the next instant, on the counter between us lay a parchment document, and following the indication of that white muscular hand, I read the words, "And to Mr. Frederick Reed, of 14 High Street, Alton, I bequeath the sum of £1,000 for certain service rendered to me." "I have had that will drawn up within the last 24 hours, and I signed it an hour ago, in the presence of competent witnesses. I am prepared, you see. Now, do you accept my offer, or not?" My answer was to walk across the room and take down my hat, and then lock the door of the surgery communicating with the house. It was a dark, icy cold night, and somehow the courage and determination which the sight of my own name in connection with £1,000 had given me, flagged considerably as I found myself hurried along through the silent darkness by a man whose deathbed I was about to attend. He was grimly silent, but as his hand touched mine, in spite of the frost, it felt like a burning coal. On we went, tramp, tramp, through the snow, on, till even I grew weary, and at length on my appalled ear struck the chimes of a church clock, whilst close at hand I distinguished the snowy hillocks of a churchyard. Heavens! Was this awful scene of which I was to be the witness to take place veritably amongst the dead? 11, groaned the doomed man. Gracious God! But 2 hours more, and that ghostly messenger will bring the summons. Come, come, for mercy's sake, let us hasten. There was but a short road separating us now from a wall which surrounded a large mansion, and along this we hastened until we reached a small door. Passing through this, in a few minutes we were stealthily ascending the private staircase to a splendidly furnished apartment, which left no doubt of the wealth of its owner. All was intensely silent, however, through the house, and about this room in particular there was a stillness that, as I gazed around, struck me as almost ghastly. My companion glanced at the clock on the mantel-shelf, and sank into a large chair by the side of the fire with a shudder. "Only an hour and a half longer," he muttered. "Great heaven! I thought I had more fortitude. This horror unmans me." Then, in a fiercer tone, and clutching my arm, he added, "Ha! You mock me, you think me mad, but wait till you see, wait till you see." I put my hand on his wrist, for there was now a fever in his sunken eyes, which checked the superstitious chill which had been gathering over me, and made me hope that, after all, my first suspicion was correct, and that my patient was but the victim of some fearful hallucination. "Mock you?" I answered soothingly. "Far from it. I sympathize intensely with you, and would do much to aid you. You require sleep. Lie down and leave me to watch." He groaned, but rose, and began throwing off his clothes, and, watching my opportunity, I slipped a sleeping powder, which I had managed to put in my pocket before leaving the surgery, into the tumbler of claret that stood beside him. The more I saw, the more I felt convinced that it was the nervous system of my patient which required my attention, and it was with sincere satisfaction I saw him drink the wine, and then stretch himself on the luxurious bed. "Ha!" thought I, as the clock struck 12, and instead of a groan, the deep breathing of the sleeper sounded through the room. "You won't receive any summons tonight, and I may make myself comfortable." Noiselessly, therefore, I replenished the fire, poured myself out a large glass of wine, and, drawing the curtain, so that the firelight should not disturb the sleeper, I put myself in a position to follow his example. How long I slept I know not, but suddenly I aroused with a start and as ghostly a thrill of horror as ever I remember to have felt in my life. Something, what I knew not, seemed near, something nameless, but unutterably awful. I gazed round. The fire emitted a faint blue glow, just sufficient to enable me to see that the room was exactly the same as when I fell asleep, but that the long hand of the clock wanted but 5 minutes of the mysterious hour which was to be the death moment of the summoned man. Was there anything in it, then? Any truth in the strange story he had told? The silence was intense. I could not even hear a breath from the bed, and I was about to rise and approach, when again that awful horror seized me, and at the same moment my eye fell upon the mirror opposite the door, and I saw— Great heaven! That awful shape! That ghastly mockery of what had been humanity! Was it really a messenger from the buried, quiet dead? It stood there in visible death clothes, but the awful face was ghastly with corruption, and the sunken eyes gleamed forth a green glassy glare, which seemed a veritable blast from the infernal fires below. To move or utter a sound in that hideous presence was impossible, and like a statue I sat and saw that horrid shape move slowly towards the bed. What was the awful scene enacted there, I know not. I heard nothing, except a low, stifled, agonized groan, and I saw the shadow of that ghastly messenger bending over the bed. Whether it was some dreadful but wordless sentence its breathless lips conveyed as it stood there, I know not, but for an instant the shadow of a claw-like hand, from which the third finger was missing, appeared extended over the doomed man's head, and then, as the clock struck one clear silvery stroke, it fell, and a wild shriek rang through the room, a death shriek. I am not given to fainting, but I certainly confess that the next 10 minutes of my existence was a cold blank, and even when I did manage to stagger to my feet, I gazed round, vainly endeavouring to understand the chilly horror which still possessed me. Thank God! The room was rid of that awful presence. I saw that, so, gulping down some wine, I lighted a wax taper and staggered towards the bed. Ah, how I prayed that, after all, I might have been dreaming, and that my own excited imagination had but conjured up some hideous memory of the dissecting room. But one glance was sufficient to answer that. No, the summons had indeed been given and answered. I flashed the light over the dead face, swollen, convulsed still with the death agony, but suddenly I shrank back. Even as I gazed, the expression of the face seemed to change. The blackness faded into a deathly whiteness. The convulsed features relaxed, and, even as if the victim of that dread apparition still lived, a sad solemn smile stole over the pale lips. I was intensely horrified, but still I retained sufficient self-consciousness to be struck professionally by such a phenomenon. Surely there was something more than supernatural agency in all this. Again I scrutinized the dead face, and even the throat and chest, but, with the exception of a tiny pimple on one temple beneath the cluster of hair, not a mark appeared. To look at the corpse, one would have believed that this man had indeed died by the visitation of God, peacefully, whilst sleeping. How long I stood there I know not, but time enough to gather my scattered senses and to reflect that, all things considered, my own position would be very unpleasant if I was found thus unexpectedly in the room of the mysteriously dead man. So, as noiselessly as I could, I made my way out of the house. No one met me on the private staircase. The little door opening into the road was easily unfastened, and thankful indeed was I to feel again the fresh wintry air as I hurried along that road by the churchyard. There was a magnificent funeral soon in that church, and it was said that the young widow of the buried man was inconsolable. And then rumours got abroad of a horrible apparition which had been seen on the night of the death, and it was whispered the young widow was terrified, and insisted upon leaving her splendid mansion. I was too mystified with the whole affair to risk my reputation by saying what I knew, and I should have allowed my share in it to remain forever buried in oblivion, had I not suddenly heard that the widow, objecting to many of the legacies in the last will of her husband, intended to dispute it on the score of insanity. And then there gradually arose the rumour of his belief in having received a mysterious summons. On this I went to the lawyer, and sent a message to the lady that, as the last person who had attended her husband, I undertook to prove his sanity, and I besought her to grant me an interview, in which I would relate as strange and horrible a story as ear had ever heard. The same evening I received an invitation to go to the mansion. I was ushered immediately into a splendid room, and there, standing before the fire, was the most dazzlingly beautiful young creature I had ever seen. She was very small, but exquisitely made. Had it not been for the dignity of her carriage, I should have believed her a mere child. With a stately bow she advanced, but did not speak. "I come on a strange and painful errand," I began, and then I started, for I happened to glance full into her eyes, and from them down to the small right hand grasping the chair. The wedding ring was on that hand. "I conclude you are the Mr. Reed who requested permission to tell me some absurd ghost story, and whom my late husband mentions here." And as she spoke, she stretched out her left hand towards something, but what I knew not, for my eyes were fixed on that hand. Horror! White and delicate it might be, but it was shaped like a claw, and the third finger was missing. One sentence was enough after that. "Madam, all I can tell you is, that the ghost who summoned your husband was marked by a singular deformity. The third finger of the left hand was missing," I said sternly, and the next instant I had left that beautiful, sinful presence. That will was never disputed. The next morning, too, I received a cheque for £1,000, and the next news I heard of the widow was, that she had herself seen that awful apparition, and had left the mansion immediately. End of section 3. Section 4 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Baron's Coffin, published in Belgravia in 1869. The Baron's Coffin, Chapter 1. The Discovery. Down in the southwest of France, not very far from Bordeaux, or, to speak more exactly, about the middle of a line drawn directly from that town to Ayr, stands a curious old chateau. You might pass within a stone's throw of it, and not be aware of its existence, so closely is it shrouded by the thick forest of pines for which that part of the country is famed. Its position is very solitary, far removed from even a village, and the little rutty road leading to it is but a cross and unfrequented cut from one highway to another. Still, there it stands under the blue skies of Gascony, surrounded by its dark woods, an enviable possession, in spite of its loneliness and queer architecture. And dark deeds were done there in times, and by men not very long passed away. I made acquaintance with the place, under a professional introduction, in this wise. I was an architect, young, struggling, with, I thought, a great deal of talent, which society neglected to its own injury and mine. I had no work, and I had no means. Moreover, I was in feeble health. One day my old master, who had always had a kindness for me, said, "Owen, my boy, I've got a job for you to do, if you are not too much engaged." The dear old fellow spoke quite gravely, though he knew as well as I did that my only engagements were dinners and suppers with my fellow idlers. To go abroad. "I dare say I could manage it," I replied quickly. "It's to go and examine an old chateau in the south of France. A tumble-down old place, I'm told, but which the family pride of its possessor won't allow to go to utter ruin. You've heard me speak of old Baron de Gaulle? Well, it's one of his places. The one, I believe, from which his family derive their title, and though he hates his native country like the devil, he wants to take care of the old chateau. The job won't take you very long, but after you've made your report, he wants the place thoroughly repaired, or rather, restored. You can pass your summer weeks very pleasantly by taking up your lodging there and directing the work. You are to have English workmen sent to you. The old Baron would use English mortar, I believe, if he could. You speak French, I think? Almost as well as English, I replied thankfully. Then the business is settled. I will give you the address of Monsieur de Gaulle, and you can take his directions from himself. The Baron's directions were not much longer than my master's. Only restore the place, add nothing, take away nothing, my good sir, and spare no expense. In 24 hours after hearing those words I was on my way. In 48 hours I was standing within the pine wood, looking up at the crazy curious old chateau, wondering whether successive generations had contrived this piece of architectural patchwork, or some clever but muddled brain. Its only occupant was a tall, middle-aged woman, who, to my eyes, unaccustomed to the dark beauty and picturesque costume of the southern women, offered a charming contrast to our English peasantry. She was prepared for my coming, and received me hospitably, not altogether sorry, I fancied, to have some break in her monotonous life, and some companion for her solitude, for I found she had been busily employed for my comfort, and was most courteous in her endeavours to smooth the way to conversation. Truth to tell, my French was not quite so perfect as I had first thought it. However, we soon became excellent friends, and though my conversation was confined to short phrases and pleasant grimaces, I soon learnt to understand her perfectly. It was rather a dull life, when the novelty of the place and climate had worn off. My surveying, of course, occupied most of my mornings, but I had no intention of overworking myself, and it was difficult to find amusement for the leisure hours. I couldn't always be walking about the country. Being companionless, it was slow work. Neither could I be content to spend the long evenings smoking under the pines. Again, even Josette's conversation was apt to grow tiresome, and I had no books beyond those my profession required. I began to understand the word ennui, and to feel ungrateful to the old Baron for his job, and to pine for London smoke, when one morning Josette, to whom I had confided my disgust of life, said, in her most maternal tones, "Monsieur should distract his mind. Why doesn't Monsieur read? Reading is very amusing." I believe Josette thought she was introducing me to a new branch of education. She spoke the word "read" in so solemn a voice. "And where shall I find the books?" I asked impatiently. "Surely Monsieur knows. Surely Monsieur can get them for himself," Josette said nervously. "He certainly could, if he knew where from," I answered pettishly. "Why, in Monsieur le Baron's room there were books, numbers." "In the Baron's room? Whereabouts?" "Why, under the big bed." And after saying that, Josette put the bottle of wine she was bringing me on the table, and went out of the room. I finished my breakfast, and then went up slowly to the room called the Baron's. It was in a very out-of-the-way part of the house. Low-ceilinged, octagon-shaped, and furnished with lumbering old furniture, after the bare fashion of old French chateaux. I had visited it but once or twice, my attention being still given to the more modern portion of the house. Evidently Josette held it in disfavour, for the dust lay thickly on chairs and tables, and on some of the furniture were large stains of mould, while over the closed windows spiders had woven curtains of delicate web. I threw open the jalousies and let in a little of the fresh air and morning sunshine, and as I did so, a rustling and then sweeping sound came from under the English four-post bed, which stood in gloomy grandeur in the corner of the room. I was not of a nervous temperament, and that sound did not even startle me, but when, the next moment, I stooped and lifted up the moth-eating hangings to search for the box of books, I certainly did start back with an exclamation of something more than surprise. Under the bed stood a large black coffin. For an instant I felt inclined to get away as fast as I could. I turned sick, but, as I said before, I was not naturally nervous, and the feeling soon passed off. Besides, the sunshine was flooding the dusty old room, and from the window a peaceful scene of woods and fields and deep blue sky was visible, and I hold that daylight and nature are powerful foes to fear and superstition. I looked again. It was a coffin, of that there was no doubt. A large coffin, too, covered with black velvet and studded with black nails, and the lid was lying on it, but it bore no plate or cross or ornament of any kind. A sudden idea crossed my mind. It contained the books, perhaps, and so I put forth my hand bravely, and, using all my strength, drew it forward. There was something uncanny in the hollow sound made by the lid as it fell on the ground, but I would not be horrified, and with a brave hand I lifted up a large sheet of fine lawn neatly covering something, and then a yellow piece of linen, and then something that looked like a garment. Grave clothes, I thought to myself, and then my fingers touched some hard substances. Books, thank heaven! A few dusty, ponderous volumes of Voltaire, Rousseau, and other philosophers of the same genus, I soon pulled forth to the light of day, which they had evidently not seen for years, so yellow were their pages. And then I found a cushion lining the bottom, and a little pillow on which was the visible impress of a human head and a stain or two of blood. The sight of the books had reassured me, but that round scoop in the pillow and the stains gave me another uncomfortable thrill. I turned eagerly to the lid and examined it. It had been used. There were the holes of the screws, and one long rusty nail was still sticking firmly in it, whilst on the outside were marks of its having come in close contact with a clayey soil. It had a dreadfully earthy smell, too. I drew back with a faint shudder. After all, it was a gloomy object to find under that gloomy bed, in that ancient gloomy room, and Josette had been so eloquent during our solitary evenings, with horrible stories of the de Gaulles past and present, that I may be pardoned if, as I bent over this strange piece of lumber, and heard shuffling footsteps coming faintly along the passage, I uttered a horrified cry. The footsteps came nearer, and, it seemed to me, more rapidly, as my scream, or rather exclamation, sounded awfully audible through the stillness of the house. And then to my horror the door of the room was opened suddenly, and a face, that even now I can never think of without a shudder, peered through it. It was so old that features bearing the stamp of 70 years would have seemed youthful beside it, drawn and puckered and shrunk till it scarcely looked human, while two red seams on either side of the mouth seemed to extend it from ear to ear in a perpetual ghastly grin. On the chin grew a scanty tuft of long white hairs, but the scalp was entirely bald. And to increase the horror of such an object, the left ear was gone, and the right so frightfully mutilated that it was only by the position I recognized what the hideous lump of flesh had been. My first thought was, that before me stood the former occupant of the coffin, and all the stories of ghosts, vampires, dead men wandering about their old haunts, wronged spirits tormenting those who had wronged them, rushed to my mind with the terrible conviction that I was about to be forced to add myself to the number of their believers, when from that hideous mouth came the sound of a human voice. "Que faites-vous là?" said the aged apparition tremulously. I don't know exactly what I said or what I did. I have a faint recollection of pitching a volume of Rousseau at the spectre's head, and then rushing down the old staircase at a rate that was increased by hearing a peal of goblin laughter echo through the house. Josette met me. "Mais qu'est-ce que c'est donc?" she exclaimed in alarm. "Have you seen the ghost of old Monsieur le Baron?" "I have seen an awful object," I answered breathlessly. "I have seen—" "Moi!" exclaimed a voice on the staircase, and looking up, there we saw the hideous face grinning at us over the balustrades. "Ah, mon pauvre grand-père, c'est toi!" said Josette composedly. Then turning to me she laughed till the tears dimmed her black eyes. I went out of the chateau in a huff, for I was young enough to resent being laughed at by a woman, even though that woman were an ignorant peasant, and I remained out until nearly dark. When I returned to the chateau, I found my dinner comfortably prepared for me, and Josette in a repentant frame of mind. She did not make allusion to the morning's adventure, but when she brought me in my dessert she said, with the gracious familiarity the French lower class so often assume with their superiors, that she and her grandfather were going to sit in the garden under the limes, and that if I would come and smoke my cigar, I should find it very pleasant. And, added Josette, her grandpapa would be so glad to have a little talk, and he did not look so ugly in the dusk. I was not altogether pleased with the invitation, but I could not do otherwise than accept it. The old man received me very politely. He was sitting in an armchair, placed so that the moonlight did not fall on his ghastly features. We made a few observations on the scene, on my object in coming to the chateau, etc., and then the old man, keeping his hands curled in a curious fashion over the places where his ears ought to have been, I suppose to supply their lost assistance, said, "I am sorry I frightened Monsieur this morning. I know I am a frightful object to look upon, but at 100 years of age one can't expect to be handsome." "100 years? Are you really as old as that?" "Mais oui, monsieur. It's a long life, a very long life, and the times I have passed through have been stirring times for France and Frenchmen, but I'm getting weary of it. Why, monsieur, my playmates were those whose bones are buried in heaps at Marengo and Austerlitz, who lie deep down in the blood pits of the guillotine. I don't wonder you took me for a ghost. Why, mine ought to be wandering about with the old barons. We've played together in life many a time." The old man's voice trembled more as he spoke the last words. "The old baron!" I exclaimed. "That is the father of the present Monsieur de Gaulle, I suppose? Why, what makes his ghost walk more than the other de Gaulles? Was he more wicked? And perhaps you can tell me for what reason he kept that ugly great coffin under his bed?" "The coffin? Ah, the great black coffin," repeated the old man slowly. "I remember that time well." "Tell us, grandfather," said Josette. "It's a beautiful night to tell a story in the open air. Wait, and I'll give you a goutte to brighten your memory. There. Now, tell us about the black coffin under the baron's bed." End of section 4. Section 5 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Baron's Coffin. Chapter 2. The Family Feud. I won't tell you, monsieur, began the old man, about the grandeur of the old chateau at one time, about the wealth and power of the de Gaulles, and about their long history of wickedness. I dare say Josette has told you enough about all that, but you must try and bear it in mind if you would understand the story of the old Baron's coffin. It was about the year '94, a bloody time, monsieur, when those that deserved it and those that didn't met together at the guillotine, when men were hunted about like wild beasts by wild beasts, when there was no peace or rest or safety in any corner of poor wretched France, when brothers turned against brothers, and parents feared their own children. It was in the very thick of those times that Monsieur Louis was Baron de Gaulle. His father had died when he was but a child, and he came into the money and estates when it would have been much better for him to have been still under the rod of the schoolmaster. He was a tall, fine man, not handsome, but of a figure that looked made for command. He liked commanding, too, commanding not only the servants about him, but his equals, his brother and sisters, his friends and relations, everybody about him. It was an unfortunate temper. But in those times it was dangerous to displease the lower classes, and Monsieur, as he was called, for he had dropped his title like everybody else who cared for his head, had to restrain his temper, at any rate, towards his dependents. Perhaps that made him fiercer towards his brother and sisters. He certainly was a tyrant to them, especially to Monsieur Paul, and no one was much surprised when one morning Monsieur Paul went off to Paris and joined the revolutionary party. He was a very handsome man, as different from his brother as day is from night, but though he had pleasant manners, and kind words for everyone, there was something in his eyes that told you the de Gaulle wickedness had found a hiding place somewhere about him. I don't believe he loved anyone, though he pretended to like his proud tyrannical brother, and to be sorry for his sisters. I don't believe he loved even pretty Mademoiselle Paulina, who almost broke her heart when he went away, and who was the only one of the de Gaulles who will ever get into heaven, if what Monsieur le Curé says is true. From the time Monsieur Paul went to Paris, a change came over Monsieur. He was gloomier than ever, but more civil to those about him, and he seemed to take greater interest in all the bloody work that was going on in the dreadful city. Till that time the family, in spite of its rank and wealth, had fared well enough. They had been forced to yield up some of their property, but otherwise the revolution had done them little injury. It is true, the family consisted of only the 2 brothers and their 3 sisters, and they all lived together in the quiet old chateau, far away from even a village. But in those times, seclusion did not ensure safety. Monsieur had always inclined to revolutionary principles. Indeed, the de Gaulles, even in the most flourishing times of the Bourbons, had never been famous for loyalty, and at the commencement of the Revolution he professed open republicanism. He contented himself with professing, however, and abode quietly in his old chateau. I've heard it said that Monsieur Louis was learned, that he read enough to turn his brain, but I know that I never saw him with a book in his hand. He would stay for days in his room, that called the Baron's, but whenever I went in to attend him, he was either sitting gloomily in his chair, or standing staring out of the window, and though books lay scattered about the room, not one did I ever see him touch. Well, monsieur, after Monsieur Paul went to Paris, as I said before, Louis grew gloomier than ever. At first it was a quiet kind of gloom. Then it became restless and then anxious. We all saw that, for Monsieur Louis was the head of the family, the master of us all, in spite of the revolution, and we used to watch him, and study his face and his temper as some people do a weather-glass, and somehow, when he looked pleased, the old chateau seemed gayer, and we were all happier, whilst if Monsieur looked cross or sad, it was a dull time for us. After Monsieur Paul went away, there was not a gleam of happiness on Monsieur Louis's face from one end of the week to the other. First he shut himself up in his room, then he took to wandering about the house, coming down among us servants in the kitchen, and going to the rooms of the young ladies. He seemed to hate being alone, though when he was with anyone he never talked. And after that mood passed away, he took to riding about the country, visiting the villages and the nearest towns. Sometimes after these visits he would throw himself off his horse and come striding into the chateau, his breath coming in great gasps, and his eyes rolling fiercely as he looked round on all of us, and he would shout out the last news from Paris as if it were almost maddening him. Poor little Mademoiselle Paulina would creep up to him then and try to soothe him, but he would shake her off and drive her from him, though at other times he would speak to her more kindly than he ever spoke to any other human being. Those were wretched days indeed, monsieur. One day I was helping in the kitchen. There were not many servants about the chateau in those times. Besides, I was a clever cook, and could serve up a dinner which even Monsieur Louis enjoyed. When I heard Monsieur coming along the passage, clanging his spurs on the stones. There's no change for the better in his humour, I thought to myself as I listened. And I was right, for the next moment he put his fierce face into the room, and shouted to me to go to him, as if I were a dog and he my master. "I suppose you'd be frightened to put your nose outside the gates," he exclaimed scornfully. "You wouldn't have the courage to go to Bordeaux." "To Bordeaux, monsieur?" I replied in amazement. "Has monsieur any business for me to do there?" Instead of replying, he fixed on me his stern eyes, as if he would read my very soul. But I bore it without shrinking. I knew I was a faithful servant, and not a coward. Then he stretched out his hand, and as he laid it on my shoulder, I felt that it trembled like a child's. "Antoine," he said, "I believe as far as men can be good and true, in these God-deserted times, you are. I am going to test your fidelity and friendship, and I vow that, if ever the life shall be spared me, I will repay you if you stand by me in this hour of trouble." "Monsieur has only to say what he requires done," I answered quietly. "My family was always faithful to the de Gaulles." He put his arm through mine and led me out to the group of pines standing just to the left of the chateau. Though the sunshine was pouring down like molten gold on the country all round, it was cool as an autumn evening under the shade of the wood, and Monsieur seemed to grow calmer as we walked among the trees. "It's the old story, Antoine," he began, after carefully looking round. "The old story of brotherly hatred and treachery." I started. "Not Monsieur Paul!" I exclaimed. For though I had always liked him better than Monsieur Louis, I distrusted him, and always feared that some day the evil shining through his blue eyes would work its way out somehow. "What?" said Monsieur scornfully. "Have you too been taken in by his false smiles? Perhaps you would rather serve him than me, would you? Speak quickly." His fierceness came back again. He seized my arm, and, with another of those alarmed looks round him, put his other hand in his bosom as if in search of something. "I serve the head of the family," I replied calmly. "I am the servant of the Baron de Gaulle, not of Monsieur Paul." He looked at me again, and then dropping my arm, said, I will trust you. I must trust you. You know I can reward you if you are faithful, and I think you know my temper well enough to know also that I could and would revenge myself if betrayed. I did indeed, and yet I did not shrink from him. I have heard from Paris, he said in a quieter tone, that there is every reason to believe my brother is playing treacherously with me. He hates me, and wants the property. You can guess what he means to do. "Denounce monsieur," I whispered. I am told that there is someone waiting to see me at Bordeaux, who has a message for me from Paul. Some overtures he wishes to make, I suppose, and I am further told that it will be the worse for me if I do not meet this messenger. Monsieur paused a moment, then he added, "Now, Antoine, if I go—" "Monsieur must not go," I interrupted. "He must send me." "You would not be afraid? Cities are not like the quiet country." "Monsieur, Antoine Bouteille never knew fear," I replied. "I believe you," he exclaimed, "and that is more than I can say to any other man in the world. Antoine, I accept your service. Give me your hand, and swear that, come what will, you will keep faith fast to me, and not be won over by the false smiles and promises of my brother Paul." So, putting my hand in my master's, I swore as he desired. Remember, monsieur, that hand was then the clean hand of a French nobleman. There was only honour in touching it then. End of Section 5. Section 6 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Baron's Coffin. Chapter 3. The Message. It was a long distance to Bordeaux. The old sundial standing in the courtyard of the chateau marked scarcely noon, as, mounted on Monsieur Louis's own horse, I began my journey, and it was not very far off midnight when I reached the city. It was but feebly lighted by lamps in some of the principal streets, and had it not been for the bright moonlight pouring down on it, and on the broad Garonne, I should have had some difficulty in finding the particular spot where I was to meet Monsieur Paul's messenger. I knew it was to be on the quay, but I could not help being a little startled when a tall man wrapped in a cloak came and laid his hand on my horse's bridle. "Vous voilà," said a voice that, in spite of the folds of the cloak being drawn over his mouth, I recognized as Monsieur Paul's. I saluted him immediately, and then for the first time he seemed to be aware that I was not his brother. He drew back, muttering something between his teeth. "Monsieur Louis couldn't come," I said. "He was not well enough to bear the fatigue of such a ride, but he has sent me to hear the news of Monsieur Paul." "Ill," exclaimed Monsieur Paul, with a low, cruel laugh. "Ill to death, I suppose. Perhaps it would be better for him that it was so." "I hope not, monsieur," I replied, as if I knew nothing about his hatred for his brother, and trying to talk in the same respectful but familiar way I was accustomed to do with Monsieur Paul. "I hope there's no bad news for him, no bad news for the family." Monsieur Paul walked on beside my horse for a few minutes without speaking. At length he turned to me, and said in his own quiet voice, but anxiously, "It's not likely, Antoine, that I should be away from my post in Paris at this time, unless fears for my family induced me. I have some power with the party now paramount, but not sufficient to ensure protection to a declared enemy of the Republic." "Monsieur Louis an enemy of the Republic!" I exclaimed. "Why, there couldn't be a stauncher supporter of it. He's as red a Republican as yourself, Monsieur Paul." "Bah, my good friend, it's easy enough to lie in this world, but not so easy to make yourself believed. Monsieur Paul replied, taking out a small pocket-book and beginning to scribble something in it as he walked. "Look here, Antoine, I daren't do more than this. I daren't say more, but the sooner my brother Louis gets out of France, the better for him. Give him this paper, and tell him what I've told you. These are fearful times for us all. Natural ties bind no more than wisps of straw. Some fiend is calling for blood, blood, and as long as one can save one's own self, one dare not deny that of one's kindred. Go back to the chateau, Antoine, as fast as you can, and do as I tell you. It's the best and only advice I can give. Good night." He stood there under the moonlight, saying that in his quiet voice, and looking so sad and anxious that I could not but think he meant what he said, and that Monsieur Louis's suspicious nature had led him to imagine evil. I touched my cap to him. "If you would just say a word how to manage to get master away, monsieur, I don't believe he will be persuaded." "Tant pis pour lui," he replied, moving off. "I have done what I can. Good night." And before I could say another word, he was gone. I was not much of a scholar, and turn about that little bit of paper Monsieur Paul had given me as I would, I could not make out a single word. But I was fortunate enough to meet little Mademoiselle Paulina in the pine wood, as about noon next day I rode into the chateau grounds. No one knew where I had been except Monsieur Louis, but I suppose Mademoiselle guessed there was something unusual stirring to occasion my long absence, and she was on the watch. A sweeter, kinder-hearted little lady than Mademoiselle Paulina I never knew. She was the only good thing about that gloomy old place, for the other two young ladies were very much like their brothers in disposition, Mademoiselle Marie resembling Monsieur Louis, and Mademoiselle Clotilde Monsieur Paul. Well, when she caught sight of me, she came running up, and catching hold of the horse's mane, she exclaimed, "Where have you been, Antoine? Tell me at once. I know there is something wrong going on by Louis's face. Tell me out truly and boldly, Antoine." And she tried to look commanding and stern like her brother, but couldn't, because she was terribly frightened. "Mademoiselle," I said sorrowfully, "if you want to know your brother's secrets, you had better ask him. Will you be kind enough to read this paper to me? It's a note I have just found on the road." She took it and glanced at it, and then looking up at me she cried, "Antoine, do not lie! This is my brother Paul's writing. Where did you get it?" "Will mademoiselle read it to me?" She bent her head over it, and her hand shook like an aspen leaf. "Things are looking black for you. The only plan I can think of is flight, or the one suggested. Should you determine on the former, let me know, and I will do all I can to delay a crisis." We were neither of us great scholars, though mademoiselle could read beautifully, and when she looked up and asked me in a frightened tone what it meant, I could tell no more than she. "Did Paul give it to you?" she asked presently. "What? Has he been so near without coming to see us, to see me?" And then she bent her poor tearful eyes again over the paper, and read once more. "It's very dreadful," she said, "but do you know, Antoine, sometimes I think that—" She paused. "It's awful not to be able to trust one's own brother," she added. "Let us go to Louis." Monsieur was in his room, standing staring out of the window, as was his habit. He let me come in, but mademoiselle remained at the door. Then I told him about my meeting with Monsieur Paul, and he gave a horrible smile, as I told him how disappointed he seemed at finding it was not his brother. And he muttered, "I thought so, I thought as much." And then, catching hold of my arm, he cried loud enough for mademoiselle to hear, "Why didn't you shoot him dead where he stood? Traitor! You are all traitors together, to hold his life in your hand, when you knew it was a question between mine and his, and not take his. My God! And then he tore the paper from my hand and almost hurled me out of the room. And there, as his sister and I stood in the passage, we could hear him raging within like a furious beast. Mademoiselle Paulina put her hand on the balustrades and crept downstairs, and then, as I followed her, she drew me into her own little room. "Good, kind Antoine," she said, with her cheeks looking hot and red, and her eyes wild. "What shall we do? I believe he spoke truly. It must and will be his life or Paul's. They hate each other like wicked fiends instead of loving each other as brothers. What shall we do?" "If Monsieur Louis would leave France," I began. "He will never do that. He will stay and fight it out," she answered. "Why, Antoine, you have known Louis all his life, and can you remember a single instance of his giving way?" I shook my head. "Or of Paul being true?" she went on. "No, no, Antoine. The de Gaulles have been a sinful race from the beginning, and in the end it will be the same. What shall we do, Antoine?" Meanwhile, overhead we could hear the furious tread of Monsieur Louis. It startled the poor young lady several times, and each time she exclaimed, "What shall we do?" And then Mademoiselle Clotilde called her, and she was obliged to go away. There were so few servants in the chateau, the young ladies were obliged to do a great deal, and somehow it always seemed that Mademoiselle Paulina had the heaviest share of household work. As she went away, she whispered, "Don't tell anyone, Antoine, and after dinner come into the great salon. I want to speak to you." I never shall forget that dinner. I waited behind Mademoiselle Marie's chair, for Monsieur Louis still remained in his room, and it was dreadful to watch the face of little Mademoiselle Paulina opposite. But she bore up bravely, ate and drank, and talked to her sisters as if her heart was the happiest in the world. Only once or twice, as she caught my eye, she gave a little start when Monsieur Louis's footsteps overhead frightened her. Then I went to her in the great salon, but Mademoiselle Clotilde came too, and so I could get no more talk with her that night. As for Monsieur Louis, he went out as soon as the dusk had fallen, and did not return till dawn, and then, to judge by the sweat his horse was in, he must have ridden far and hard. He looked frightfully haggard, and his eyes were fierce and bloodshot, but as I opened the great door to him, he said to me so gently, "Get to bed, Antoine," that I took courage to reply, "I was in hopes, monsieur, that you'd gone for good." "No, Antoine, I'll fight it out with him," he answered, but in a less ferocious tone than I had heard him use for a long time when speaking of his brother. End of section 6. Section 7 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Baron's Coffin. Chapter 4. The Stratagem. How we watched the next day! Monsieur Louis from his window, I from mine, and little Mademoiselle Paulina from the flat roof of a part of the chateau, to which she had ascended through a small window in the roof. How we watched! How we listened to the slightest sound on the road! But the time rolled on. Noon, afternoon, evening came, and there was no sign of soldiers near. The old chateau still stood peacefully among the unbroken stillness of the pine woods. Monsieur Louis had been gloomier than ever all day, but to me and to Mademoiselle Paulina he spoke once or twice in an almost kind manner. He took nothing from dawn to dusk except a crust of bread and a large glass of brandy, and I observed that he scarcely ever moved from his standing position at the window. I had often seen him stern and unsociable, but never in such a mood before. When it was quite dusk he roused himself a little, and then, precisely at 9 o'clock, he put on a large cloak, and, calling me to follow him, set off at a rapid pace through the wildest and most secluded part of the grounds. We walked very fast, but it was dark when we reached the confines, and there, under a tree, I could dimly see the figures of 2 men, with some dark object lying at their feet. My master walked on, and spoke for some minutes to these men, and then they went away, leaving the dark object on the ground. Monsieur waited till they were out of sight, and then he called to me, and, pointing to the thing, said, "Antoine, I want you to help me carry this." It was a large black coffin. "Is it heavy?" I asked, rather horrified, and raising up one end. "Not so heavy as it will soon be," my master replied in his fierce voice. "Now then, move on." While he spoke he had lifted up the other end, and there we both stood in the dark night, with that hideous thing on our shoulders. As we walked home, more slowly than we had come on account of our burden, fearful thoughts filled my mind. What could Monsieur want a coffin for? Was there an occupant ready for it, or did he mean to commit suicide? The last surmise seemed scarcely probable. Suicides seldom trouble themselves with funeral arrangements. When we reached the chateau, who should meet us, creeping out of the great salon, but Mademoiselle Paulina? She carried a candle in her hand, and I shall never forget her white scared face, as she held it up and let its light fall on the great black coffin. "What is it for?" she muttered between her clenched teeth. "Oh, Louis, it is not Paul. Say it is not Paul." But Monsieur Louis only lowered the coffin from his shoulder, and, telling me to carry it up to his room, himself led the way. Mademoiselle Paulina followed, and then, as we set our load down in the centre of the polished floor, she dropped into her brother's large chair, and exclaimed again, "Oh, Louis, say it isn't Paul." He took no notice of her, but, taking the candle, knelt down by the coffin, and began examining it carefully, and I did the same. There were small holes in the lid, and it was deeper than coffins usually are, whilst at the back there was a large air hole, carefully concealed by the fringe of the lid. I began to understand its use, and so did Mademoiselle Paulina. "Now then, Antoine, listen to me," Monsieur said, as he looked up, with horrible satisfaction, from his examination. I was not to be deceived by that kind advice to fly from France. I knew well enough what would happen, and I would rather face them all here with my sword in my hand, than be fired at in flight. If I should be arrested by order of the Convention, I also know my fate. This is what I propose doing. If strangers come to the chateau, you must give out that I am dead, and immediately close the coffin lid on me, and bury me in the vault in the chapel. If Paul comes with them, you need only place me in the coffin, and leave him and me to do the rest. You can let me stay safely in the vault for 12 hours, but after that, Antoine, Paulina, my blood will be upon your heads. There, now go. Leave me alone, for God's sake." I cannot hear of such a dreadful, wicked thing," Mademoiselle Paulina began, clasping her little white hands entreatingly. "Oh, Louis, listen to me. Hide while there is time. Hide." "And what hiding place within 10 leagues of the chateau does Paul not know?" fiercely interrupted her brother. "Oh, Louis, he is not so bad," Mademoiselle said piteously. "Only try, and I will watch and pray him." "Be silent, and go to bed. Do not preach to me. My mind is made up." Monsieur answered sternly, and then he went out of the room, and as neither I nor the poor young lady liked to be alone with that hideous thing, we also went away to another part of the house. "Oh, that these awful days were over!" Mademoiselle murmured as she went into her own room. But they were not over yet. They were only beginning. The sun rose the next morning, as bright and glowing as if it rose upon paradise, rather than great bloody France reeking like a slaughter-house. I could scarcely bear to look out on the brightness. Still, it was some comfort to see that in the sunshine the country looked peaceful and quiet as usual, that between the trees there was no sign of glittering arms or terrible uniform. I took a cup of coffee to Monsieur's room as early as possible, but found him occupied in writing, and could not induce him to take it. "Keep it for 24 hours hence, Antoine," he said. "I would dare wager I shall want it then. Remember, Antoine," he added, 12 hours at farthest. For your life, remember that." Monsieur looked at the black coffin lying at his feet as he spoke, and I shuddered. Just then Mademoiselle Paulina called me softly, and when I went to her, she beckoned me to the window where she was standing. "Look out to the west, Antoine. Do you see anything?" she said, in a quiet, frightened tone. I did look, and I saw a faint glittering far away along the Bordeaux road. "Mademoiselle, they are coming!" I said, feeling a great throb at my heart. She grasped my hand, and away we both flew to Monsieur Louis's room. I think he had seen the glittering too, for we found him hastily arranging his room, shutting the jalousies, and giving it as much as possible the trim, tidy look of a death-room. Then with trembling hands we arrayed him in the death-clothes, placed the coffin on the trestles in the centre of the floor, and him in it. He had a small vial in his hand, and as he lay there his face looked so corpse-like that I should scarcely have been afraid of Monsieur Paul himself seeing it. Then, calling in the other young ladies, to whom Mademoiselle had already explained the danger, I left the room to watch for the approach of the soldiers, and give the alarm whether Monsieur Paul was with them or not. I never shall forget the terrible anxiety of that watching. It seemed as if they would never come, and yet they were moving, ever moving along the road. Then I lost sight of them in the pine wood, and that seemed an awful moment when I again saw them. Yes, absolutely within the chateau grounds. Was Monsieur Paul with them? I looked attentively. Yes, riding a little apart from the rest. There he was, not daring to look up with his traitor eyes on the home of his ancestors. I left the window, and flew rather than ran upstairs. "Monsieur Paul is there!" I exclaimed, rushing into the room, and then with one hasty glance at the coffin, when I saw the occupant raise the vial to his lips, I ran downstairs to the courtyard, where the soldiers were already dismounting from their horses. As the captain called out for Citoyen Louis Gaule, and the rest began entering the house, Monsieur Paul beckoned me aside, and whilst he pretended to follow them, whispered, "Has he escaped? God grant that he has!" "He has, monsieur," I answered solemnly. "He died not an hour ago by his own hand. Rest his soul!" For an instant Monsieur Paul started back in pale consternation, then he seized my arm, exclaiming, "This is some trick! Louis is not the man to kill himself. Confess the truth, Antoine, and I will do what I can to keep up the deception." I was taken aback by his soft, sad tone, but I happened to look up into his evil eyes at the moment. That was sufficient. "Go and look at him, monsieur," I replied sadly. "You will not doubt then. But what could he do? It was only a choice of deaths. Poison is not worse than steel. But go and look at him." "I will," answered Monsieur Paul in a hard tone. The old man's voice quivered as he came to this, and Josette was obliged to give him another rather large gout. "I shall never forget the sickening terror," he went on presently, "with which I followed the soldiers and that cruel man up the old staircase into the Baron's room. I have gone through many dangers to myself since then, but I never remember feeling such an agony of fear as I did on entering that room, where Mademoiselle Paulina was sitting like a pale ghost on the floor, and that group of wild beasts were crowding round the coffin in the centre. I went to the opposite side to where Monsieur Paul was standing, and then I peeped over the shoulders of one of those wretches into the coffin. I started. There was Monsieur Louis, lying not in that forced stillness which he had first assumed, but dead. He could not but be dead, so white, so utterly still were his features, so motionless his body, so breathless, pulseless. And then I looked up into Monsieur Paul's face. He was regarding the corpse with a gaze that was almost fiendish. For a whole minute his eye watched the pale face with an intensity of attention that, had the life-blood been flowing in its uncovered temples, he must have discovered it. Then he stretched forth his hand and took up the dead man's arm, and for an instant it lay placidly in his fingers, and then dropped with a dull, lifeless thud on the breast. After that he turned away, and putting his arm through one of the officers, drew him apart, and talked in a low grave tone with him for some minutes. Would they be satisfied? Would they go now, and leave us in peace? I caught little Mademoiselle's eyes for a moment, and they seemed asking me that. Then Monsieur Paul and the officer came back to the rest, and the captain told them that apparently their work was done for them, that they might go down and rest themselves, and after a few savage words they went, with their swords clanging down the great staircase, a horrid sound, and Monsieur Paul, the captain, Mademoiselle, and myself were left alone with the corpse. Monsieur Paul went and again bent over the coffin, and he heaved a great sigh and murmured, "Poor Louis, if he had only been persuaded! Poor Louis!" And then the traitor stretched out his hand towards his little sister, but she shrank away, and hid her face with her cold fingers. The captain meanwhile had been standing at the window, but he came back as he heard Monsieur Paul's voice, and taking up the coffin lid, said gruffly, "Come, come, if you want us to help you with this, we must go to work at once." And then Monsieur Paul sighed again, and with a hand that trembled, but not from grief, took the lid and laid it on the coffin, and then 2 of the soldiers were called, and I was sent for tools, and in a terrible quarter of an hour, monsieur, we had screwed up a living man in that hideous coffin. As we finished, the captain said quickly, "Now to the vault, and then to breakfast. You're master here now, Paul Gaulle, and we shall expect good wine." And then he laughed, and Monsieur Paul smiled with his lips, but his evil blue eyes remained anxiously fixed on the coffin. "Let them dig a grave under the lime trees," he said calmly. "Monsieur!" I exclaimed in terror. "There's the vault in the chapel. The de Gaulles were always buried there." "Paul!" murmured the poor young lady. But he answered, "What, a suicide in the old vault? Let them dig a grave under the lime trees." "Dig the hard earth under this broiling sun?" laughed the captain. Why, the men would throw him to the dogs first. Monsieur Paul turned pale. "Well, then, to the vault," he exclaimed. And then the 3 soldiers helped me to lift up the coffin, and we bore Monsieur Louis down out of the house, across the sunny courtyard, to the little chapel, which had not been opened for many a day, and Monsieur Paul, with his own hands, helped to lift up the flagstone before the altar, and then, by the light of a single candle snatched from one of the candelabra, we lowered Baron Louis de Gaulle among the remains of his ancestors, a living man among the dead. And there we left him, and as Monsieur Paul put the key of the chapel into his pocket and came out into the sunshine, he looked round at everything with a smile. Oh, monsieur, there were fiends in those days. All that day, till set of sun, the old chateau rang with obscene merriment. The soldiers forced their way into the cellars and larder, and those who were not lying under the pines dead drunk ransacked the old chateau from roof to basement. Then they lounged about the great salon, smoking and swearing and drinking, and singing ribald songs, or hunted the young ladies from room to room, or insulted us servants, whilst Monsieur Paul sat at a little table, in the shade there of those limes, with 2 or 3 of them, and sang republican songs, and kept shouting to me to bring wine, to supply his friends with wine, the best wine. It seemed to me as if that great blazing sun would never go down, and yet the hours were rolling on, and if more than 12 passed whilst the Baron was in his living tomb, there would be blood on our heads, on poor little Mademoiselle's, who sat there still on the floor in the Baron's room, and on mine. End of section 7. Section 8 of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Baron's Coffin, Chapter 5. The Result. I cannot tell you the joy of my heart at, an hour before dark, seeing signs that those drunken wretches were about to depart. It wanted but half an hour of the 12 that Monsieur Louis might safely remain in the vault, and Mademoiselle Paulina, having come down from the room, stood in the dark shadow cast by the little chapel, waiting for me. I counted each minute as it passed, and there they rolled on, and those wretches still lingered by their horses and wouldn't mount. My God, that was the most terrible half-hour I have ever passed. Mademoiselle was standing leaning against the hard wall of the chapel, and wearying heaven with her prayers, but heaven was obdurate. 10 o'clock struck, and they were still shouting with their drunken voices in the chateau grounds. I grew desperate, and in my desperation a thought flashed across my mind. The window over the altar! Why not reach my unfortunate master by that? I fetched a flask of brandy, some tools, and a small pistol, and then, accompanied by my young lady, I crept quietly round to the back of the chapel. There was a tree growing tolerably near, and with a little exertion I soon reached the window. "Holy Mary grant you may not be too late," whispered Mademoiselle. And then I opened the window gently, and let myself down onto the ground behind the altar. I was not nervous naturally, but still there was something awful in going down among the dead to wake up the living, and a cold sweat ran down my face as I moved gently towards the altar to get a candle before descending into the vault. But, to my surprise, the flagstone lying on the altar steps nearly threw me down, and from the open vault came a faint light. Could the Baron have got out of the coffin? Almost numb with a ghastly kind of terror, I reached the edge, then down a ladder placed there into the vault. At the farther end, where the coffin had been deposited, stood a man, stooping down and watching something. Tools were scattered about, and the lid of the coffin was standing against the wall. I made no noise. I did not see the man's face, but I knew it was Monsieur Paul. Now, I thought, as Monsieur Louis said himself, it is but a question between their two lives. So I raised my pistol and pointed it at the stooping figure. Just then a feeble groan echoed through the vault, and I fired. A maddening moment followed. I saw a man turn on me like an enraged beast, and as we closed together in a struggle that was to be the death of one of us, I caught sight of a ghastly face rising from the coffin. Then, monsieur, whether I fainted or became insensible from a blow, I am not certain, but it was dark for a long time. I woke up lying on my back in the cool night air, with the stars of heaven peeping at me through the trees. Beside me was a tall figure, partially dressed in white, partially naked, busily employed in digging. The hideous reality came back to me at once. But was it Monsieur Louis or Monsieur Paul? Which life was gone? I rose up faintly and looked around. Beside me lay the black coffin with the lid covering it, and the moonlight was playing on the white features of the Baron Louis digging in the earth. As I rose up, Monsieur Louis came up to me. "We must make haste," he said, "and bury it out of sight. They'll be back again before dawn." He spoke huskily, and not altogether like a rational being, whilst his features were awful to look on. "Where is Monsieur Paul?" I asked in a low voice. "Dead," he answered, "in there," and he pointed to the coffin. "Come and dig, I tell you they'll be back before dawn." And I did dig, and the black coffin lay there beside us. "Did you kill him?" I asked presently. "Dig," said the Baron. "They'll be back, I tell you." There was a faint glimmer of dawn in the eastern sky when that grave was finished, and then I had to go to the chapel for ropes to lower the coffin into it. On the altar steps sat Mademoiselle Paulina. How she had got there, I do not know. She did not speak a word as I entered. She did not even raise her eyes from the gaping vault at her feet, but she sat like one in a trance. I returned to Monsieur Louis, and together we lowered the coffin into the grave, and shovelled in the earth. "We must make it flat! We must make it flat!" the Baron shouted as he jumped into the grave from time to time, and trod down the earth with his feet. "Flat, flat, that they may not discover it!" He looked so awful, so fiendish, almost dancing there on his brother's corpse, that at length I could stand the sight no longer, and I rushed into the chapel. The dawn was just struggling in through the open window, and its light fell on the poor young lady's bowed head. I went up to her and tried to speak, but my tongue would not utter a sound. I was dumb as the dead. And there she sat, and I stood, while outside we could hear that husky voice shouting, "Flat! Flat!" Presently he came after me, calling my name, and then, as the grey light fell on his dreadful face and figure, and his sister saw him, she started up like one awakened from a dead sleep. "Oh!" she exclaimed, "Louis, where is he?" And then she seemed suddenly to remember something. She shrieked out, "Buried alive! Buried alive!" And she fell down like a stone at her brother's feet. And those words of hers, monsieur, brought a terrible fear on me, one that, as I hope for pardon, never had crossed my mind before. I staggered like a drunken man, and was about to rush back to the grave, when the maniac caught hold of me and flung me down into the vault, and there, as I struggled in the darkness, I heard the flagstone thrown over it. The centenarian paused as he came to this, and stretched out his trembling hand towards the brandy bottle. "The horrors of that night, monsieur, you must think will never end, and I thought the same. It was terrible to lie there among the dead, and fancy you could hear the muffled cries of a man reaching you through a wall of earth. If ever I got out of that place, I knew it would be too late to save him. The deed was done. It had been a struggle between their two lives, and Louis had won. I lay there for hours, it seemed to me ages, and then, to my intense joy, I heard footsteps overhead, and a gleam of light came struggling down, and a flood of light, for so it seemed to my eyes wearied from the darkness, and women's voices called my name. I contrived to crawl out somehow, and then I found Mademoiselle, Marie, and Clotilde, one holding brandy, and the other bread, and both pale as death. It was evening, they told me. Their brother Louis had ordered them to wait until sunset before they released me. He had set off to Orléans, they believed. At any rate, he was gone, and Paulina was lying upstairs in a terrible fever, shouting out, "Buried alive! Buried alive!" They supposed in fear for me. I let them think so. I knew it was too late to do any good. I went upstairs, dressed myself, and ate, and put things straight a little after the drunken revels of the soldiers, and when it was dark I took my spade and crept out to that dreadful place under the lime trees. It was sickening work, and when I came to the black coffin, I dropped my spade and felt I could do no more. No sound came from it. I took out my chisel and set to work to take the lid off, but it was firmly screwed on, and I had to work hard for many minutes. At length it was off, and then, holding my breath with fear, I looked in. It was a ghastly sight, monsieur. A face agonized and black, with staring blue eyes, the forehead bruised and battered, and the teeth clenched, absolutely closing in the nether lip, hands grasping each other with such force that one or two fingers were quite crushed. There was no doubt of what death he had died. Years and years passed away after that. The old chateau was closed, for Monsieur Louis went to Paris and showed that he was as staunch a Republican as Monsieur Paul had been. I followed him, and more than once, as I have heard of his ferocity and seen his white savage face, I have felt certain that it was some fiend who took possession of the body of the Baron when he rose from the dead that night, and that it was not my old master, bad as he had been, who did that awful deed. As for the young ladies, Marie and Clotilde went to Italy, and took up their abode in some convent. Poor little Mademoiselle died of the fever, and well it was so, for she would have had a cruel life, haunted by the remembrance of that night. When times grew more settled, Monsieur Louis, or Baron de Gaulle, as he then dared to call himself, went to England, and married an English lady, the mother of the present Baron, and there he lived till, I suppose inspired by a love of country, he returned to the chateau for a few months' visit, and died suddenly. He never forgot his promise to me, and not only gave me money whilst living, but provided for me in his will. But we rarely met. I think even his heartlessness could not bear the sight of me. He saw no priest, and I believe the story of that awful night, of how he got his brother into the coffin, of how he overpowered him, or even of how he himself contrived to revive from that death-like trance, never passed his lips. He died as he had lived, gloomy and unrepentant. The only allusion he ever made to the past was on the evening of his death. "Antoine," he said, "under my bed you will find the black coffin. Don't bury me in that. Remember, I won't be buried in that. I could not rest." And after his death, to my surprise, I found that coffin, empty too, under the bed in his room. It looked strangely new, considering it had been buried in the earth for, I thought, years and years. How it was, how it got there, what became of the remains of Monsieur Paul, I cannot tell you. There lies the ugly thing as you saw it, after having been buried twice, and having twice mysteriously got rid of its occupant, ready for a third. And a third, monsieur, will soon be ready for it, or rather, for one of its relations, for, like the old Baron, I don't believe I could rest in it. Shall we go into the chateau, monsieur? The air blows somewhat keenly." I rose up, rather reluctant to enter the gloomy old place, but old Antoine put his arm through mine and led me in. "Those times are past and gone," he said, "and thank the good God they are. Ah, monsieur, if you like to hear stories, I can tell you many a one of those times, that while you hear shall make you forget your ennui. I can tell you something about myself which would make your flesh creep, tell you how I became the hideous object I am. But I thought I had had enough horrors for some time, and I must confess that instead of reconciling me to my solitude, that story of the Baron's coffin made me pine after my London home more than ever. It was with the greatest satisfaction that I received a letter from my employer, saying that he had changed his mind concerning the restoration of the old chateau, and he intended to employ the money in building a Gothic villa on the banks of the Thames instead, of which he hoped I would immediately set about drawing the plans. And so, in spite of the shady delicious old pine woods and the sunny blue skies of Gascony, I was very glad to turn my back on the old chateau. End of Section 8. And end of Horror Stories by Ada Buisson. Thank you for listening.